Welcome back. I thought I'd do a quick video on the recent World Championship Rapid tournament, which, unless you're under a rock, you know that Magnus Carlsen won, and to pick some of the more interesting endgames, and particularly, what I've been looking at recently is endgame mistakes, to see if they can teach us something. There's sort of like two ways you might think about learning endgames. One is looking at people's mistakes and then try to learn from other people's mistakes. And the other way is looking at exemplar games. Now, I think that you should definitely watch the video by Daniel King on the match between Neiman and Carlsen, which was an exemplar of how to play a rook and pawn endgame with an extra pawn on one wing. However, what I'm going to look at is just try and look at some of the mistakes in other endgames in this tournament and see what we can discover. So the first step is just the workflow, just to show you how you can quickly get access to these games. We're just using open source free software to quickly get access to these games, and in particular filter down to the endgames. So let's have a look at how we do that first of all. So let's go to my capture screen, which is like that. And first of all, we have to go and get the games. Now this is quite useful. Here's the website, the FIDE website. Then that's the results there. And what we want to do is pairings and results. You can see that PGN file rapid, which is the one which we're looking at. Obviously, there's been the Blitz tournament already, and now see I've downloaded it again. Now, okay, so once you've done that, so you can then go to where your downloads are, and you can see that it's there. Right, so we'll CD into that one. Just have a look what's inside there. You can see it's got rapid, it's got open and women. We're going to open, and you can see it's got one directory for each round, and you look inside that, you've got a games.pgn for each of the rounds, what they look like, all the metadata about the games and the games and moves, and it's got the clock times. What we want to do is we want to get them into a Scid versus PC, and the easiest way of doing that is creating one PGN and then importing that. You can obviously import them one by one, but what I find is this, see this command here, actually moved out of the directory, so it doesn't really help, but let me just copy that bit. The find command finds all the files and catch them, and that's what it looks like. And then as you can see, you cat them into a file which is not inside the directories you're looking at. That's caused a bit of a problem. And then now in my home directory, I've got something called wc.pgn. Right, all in one file. Perfect. Okay, good. That's all we need. Website. And now we move on to putting them into a database. Okay, I've just redone this a little bit. I wanted to show you something else, but anyway, here are all the games. That's 3,000 of them. And then what you want to do is, first of all, you want to create a database, right? This is PGN. PGN you can't save in Scid, so you create yourself a database. File, new, World Cup, Qatar, and games. New database. Could copy all the games across. That'd actually be a perfectly valid thing to do, but we might as well restrict ourselves to some end games, and that makes the management a little bit easier, right? How do we search for end games? That's easy. Search material pattern. See the way it works there. We'll just zero everything out just to get started, to get the pawns. I mean, there are better ways of doing this. In fact, I don't even need to do it because Scoutfish would go into the bigger database and find me the end games anyway. But yeah, just for argument's sake, let's just, for the fun of it, how many queen end games are there? Right, 108 queen end games. Okay, we'll just copy them across like that. Copy. Now the search. You don't need to see the whole screen, but just give you an idea of how you might want to do this. So 100 queen end games. Zero that out. And now we do rook versus rook. Should be more of them. 450. Drag them across. Copy. Okay. Bishop versus bishop. 130. Copy them across. Knight versus knight. 68 of them. A little bit rarer, so you can see sort of the rarest way of doing it. So let's zero out those now. And then we could do rook versus a bishop. No colors on that search. See what it comes up with. 88. Copy. And then rook versus a knight. 74. Copy them across. And you actually ended up with, see there, 922 games. So just the way you want to save the end games only. Say, may or may not need to do that. Right. Okay. So the next bit I'm going to do is, having done that, we now return to our Python script. And I think if you remember, sort of a base, this would be king and bishop both sides, and then add pawns onto it, right? And this time we're just going to run through. You can see the line above actually does it for you. We'll do king and knight, king and bishop, king and rook, king and queen. We'll just do the equal ones, and then obviously you've got the rook versus knight ones as well, and then number of pawns. Now I'm going to do this on another machine. I've actually finally connected my 7-piece table base, so I am going to use those endgames we just created. Use Scoutfish to search for all those endgames where you've got the one piece each, and then up pawns up to 7. So with king endgames, you can do king each, and then 5 pawns spread across both. And then for the other endgames, you can have the pieces take up 4, so you have 3 pawns distributed either way. I've run that script before. I'll probably do another video on using the 7-piece table base anyway. You run all that, and then what you get is the games which people make a mistake. A win becomes a draw, or a draw becomes a loss, and then we'll come back after I've run on that another machine, and we'll go through some of those games and see what interesting errors and so what we can learn from those errors. Yeah, okay. So after doing all of that, we've come up with 4 games where there has been a mistake in the technical phase of the end game, that is 7 pieces or under. What that misses out, in fact, I probably want to look at it a bit more in detail, is that I know there are a couple of blunders earlier on in the end game when there are more pieces on the board. I think there was one by Kamer. And I think the point there is that you need to sort of run more standard analysis, give it some time to think and go through it and spot the mistakes that way. Obviously, a table-based kind of is a very fast way of finding mistakes and knowing them for sure. Okay, so as I say, this video is just sort of showing you a workflow you should probably have a think about in terms of when you were analyzing tournaments and having a look at interesting games and so on. So what I'm going to do now is going to quickly go through these 4 games. I am going to do, I think, the first one last. And as you can see, there's 2 types of errors. One, which is a win becoming a draw, and that will be this one here. Aroni and Mendoka end up a draw. And the other one is where somebody had a drawn position and it fell into a loss. Okay, maybe while we're doing the first order, let's go to Aroni and Mendoka, and we'll go to the sort of key position towards the end of the game. Okay, this is interesting because this is one of those rook versus knight endgames we were talking about. Don't look at them very often. This is winning for Mendonca, and we'll just play a few more moves. We're not in 7 pieces yet. Now we are, and white has a pawn to compensate for the exchange down, but the rook is much more powerful than a knight in the endgame. Play a few moves, logical move, attack the knight. The next move through the win away. Just go through the game continuation and have a look at other things. So rook c3, okay, threatening the b pawn. Advance the g pawn. King got to drop back. A few moves. Obviously, the rook has to take the pawn at some stage. And it looks like in this variation, white is able to pick up the b pawn. So there was a tactic there where the b pawn fell, and you end up with this drawn position. I'll go back to this position here. The winning line, there's a few winning lines, but the main one is going a rook e7, attack the knight. The knight must give way, and there's 2 ways the knight might consider doing things. I thought the 2 logicals are either knight f3 or knight to g6. Knight f3 to be more defensive, and knight g6 to support the advance of the pawn. So let's go through knight g6 first and see what happens in that line. Check. Swing over, pick up the pawn. In this line, you can see that there's not that same tactic. The rook is able to corral the g-pawn, whilst at the same time the black king comes over and supports their own pawn, so that's winning. Go back to this knight f3 was the other potential move. Check. You get a similar scenario where the rook is strong enough to stop the pawn, and since both of black pieces are active, they'll be able to support the b pawn to queening, or getting the knight for that, and then picking up the pawn on the other side of the board. So that's that was quite interesting. I haven't looked too much detail in rook versus minor piece end games, but that was kind of a very interesting turning point. Okay, let's go back to one of the earlier games. Oh, okay, so this is kind of interesting. This is one of those really tricky rook end games. This is a drawn position. When you have the rook pawn and the bishop pawn, depending upon piece position, it can be a win, but quite often it's a draw. And this position's a draw. So let's have a look at what happened here. So Gukesh is white trying to win this game. All good so far. And this is where the mistake was made. You can see in this position, black can't take the pawn at the moment because the tactic, the rook check skewer, and then the rook pawn would promote. We just show that. And the pawn makes it through. So you can't take it. take it at the moment. But we could take that pawn if the rook was not there. This pawn here is also loose, so we could perhaps attack that. So let's have a look. The game continuation, unfortunately, was rook a4, which is a losing move. Now have a look at how Gukesh wraps this game up. Rook f7 check, king goes back, logical square, pawn up. Now I've taken that pawn, but this is terrible. This looks like a Lucina position to me. The pawn is just going through. Right, so what happened there? If we go back to win, pick this position here, rook g4, and you can see there's just no way to hold both pawns. One pawn's going to drop, and then you'll end up with a drawn endgame after that. Maybe the most resilient would be rook g6 check, I guess. Go to g5. In fact, g5, interesting, is the only drawing move. And then 6, the pawn. And in fact, it's got a lot to do with the bad position of the rook. Just can't unravel. Pawn's dropping. And one more try, I guess. That's the other unraveling way. King g6. Yeah. It's just a scrambled position. So that's quite interesting. So that's a good lesson that because of the position of the rook, white can't unwind at all. So we go back to this position here, and unfortunately, all black had to do was attack the h-pawn, pick up one of the pawns, and the poor position of the white rook. Obviously, the white rook's in that position because Gukesh has been trying to advance. Okay, so that's that one. Third game, what type of endgame we got here? Okay, this is quite interesting. So go back, it's like, here's a 7-piece endgame. This is a draw. This pawn provides enough counterplay against these two pawns. It's obviously going to tie up the rook. Rook's got to run around and get behind the pawn at some stage. Now, this is the key, right? Just ran behind the pawn, forcing the white king to decide. Obviously, the white king doesn't want to get trapped on the h-file. So there are two moves here. It's logical. So look what white played, which is a mistake, king f5. So let's see how now get trapped up. So now we attack the pawn. King's been forced away. A few lines here you consider, for instance, protecting the pawn, but then that's wasting tempos. Push our pawn. Rook a5 check often played. King c4, takes a4 check, king b3, rook a1, and black's pawn is going to go through, and white's pawn is not. That's part of the problem there. And if we go back to here, so king f5, to the game continuation, the check, our king advances. Now we do it, but can't stop this pawn. That's ultimately the issue which white has. For instance, a computer continuation is check there. Let's go up here, check again, king b6, can't stop the queening. Yeah, and if you look at some other lines here, so what's different here? Why is king f3 different? Well, now let's have a look what happens with, okay, we've got to stop the h pawn, do the check as before. Now, I was saying there are actually a couple of ways of drawing, or you just bring your king back. So check there. Go forwards, pick up the pawn, and the other line is king to c4 to support the pawns. But then the problem is now we take that pawn with check, and then our king b3 looks good. Rook a7 holding our pawn. Can't take yet. We take, he takes, and get back in time. So another way of doing it is c2, suggested by the computer. Check, and then now black either comes back this way towards the rook, and then the rook can hold the pawn, or alternatively we can check, try and hide, check, hiding away, same problem. You're going to do this for your draw. So that was the way to get the draw in this position. Unfortunately, the king should have been in a more defense orientated position, because in some lines this king is trying to get back here. Okay, and the last one we're going to look at is the most complicated one, which is a bishop endgame. And you can see this bishop endgame, I always thought it would end up hitting the 50 move rule. It's a draw, and Nepo ended up winning it. All this is fine. And then that move wasn't necessary, I guess. It's not losing, but it puts the pawn on a bad color square. And now when we get to this position here, white should have played king to d4, blocking the advance of the black king. And we'll just sort of go through. There was this game went backwards and forwards, as you can imagine, but I want to go with the computer winning line just to see what the correct strategy is. Should be 3. Let's just go through this line. See what happens here, that because of the weak pawn now, black has to keep moving back. And what actually happens is that the black king walks all the way around, will now support his pawn, and also most likely going to pick off that pawn. Now that happened because, go back to position here, there's a few drawing moves, but I think king e4 is the most natural. Just keep the black king out of the this side of the board. You've lost the pawn, and it's still regarded as being a draw. The game goes forwards in the same situation here. That big barrier, keep the black king out, is actually quite an important component of this type of endgame, which I'm sure I'm going to have a bit of a closer look at in time. Actually, there was one other endgame which I was going to do pawn separately, but I only found one interesting pawn endgame, and this one wasn't really corresponding squares either, but just sort of interesting. So you can see here the position here. It is the game is Izat versus Lajici. Now this position is winning, okay, but you've got to be very careful how to do it. So let's just quickly go through. I show you three ways to win there. Let's have a look at them. You push g4 pawn, got to be taken. Move around to the king side, advance the pawn. Let's get a win. And the second way to do it is to move your king around first. And it's pawns, it's winning. And the third way to do it is move up, basically transpose and move your king around before you advance your pawn. Okay, but unfortunately, what black did was just advance his pawn. Now the problem there is that you don't have to take it. If you take it, you lose, because the h pawn goes and you get to shepherd your pawn through. So don't take. And black probably realizes his mistake now. Don't take. Check. Take. And you can see this is a fortress. So that game ended up a draw. So I thought it was quite interesting, that pawn end game. No other real ones to look at in this tournament, but it showed pretty clearly. Be very careful. Obviously, it makes more sense usually to improve the position of your king first, but advancing the other pawn was actually fine. It was just that particular advanced f3 was a mistake. This was just to sort of show the workflow. New tournament, you want to look at the interesting endgames in it. You go to the website, download them. You bring them into your favorite GUI and create a database of them, and then you can go and use the Python tools that you have to have a look, find the blunders, or just filter for the interesting game and have a look at the tournament. Okay, hope you enjoyed that, and thank you very much for watching.